In this lecture, we will continue our series on epistemology. Previously, we discussed how epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. Given that we can know things, how do we know what we know? While there are many insights in epistemology found in the classical and medieval world, epistemology was not really considered to be a formal subject of study up until the time of Rene Descartes, who was a philosopher and mathematician in the 17th century. The fact that epistemology was not considered to be a formal subject of study until this period of time points to the fact that Descartes was really a revolutionary thinker. Following the thread of our previous lectures, we should consider what insights, if any, Descartes can share with us on the question of what is philosophy and why would anyone even bother with it. Now, right off the bat, something should seem odd with this lecture. If we recall, we first looked at the pre-Socratics, then Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. These thinkers were ancient Greek thinkers who lived in the BC era. But Descartes lived in the 17th century. This should raise a question. Why are we skipping over 1900 years to Descartes? Did nothing happen in between the time of Aristotle and Descartes? Of course, many things happened between the time of Aristotle and Descartes. The key point is this. For almost 2,000 years, Christian, Jewish, and Islamic philosophy and religion worked within the tradition established by Plato and Aristotle. These different groups tried to refine, expand, and harmonize their religious tradition with philosophy, rather than overthrowing philosophy. They wanted to marry faith and reason to the best of their ability. This is why many of the great classical and medieval thinkers were, at the very least, heavily influenced by the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition. Now, this doesn't mean that they agreed with everything Plato and Aristotle taught, but they at least acknowledged that there was a lot of wisdom to be found in these thinkers and in the tradition built upon them. But by the late medieval period, cracks began to appear. There were three major historical movements that set the stage for Descartes' project. First, there was the Renaissance. The Renaissance is characterized by returning to ancient sources outside of the tradition of Plato and Aristotle. For example, people started to read and adopt the teachings of the skeptics and the materialists, the very groups that Plato, Aristotle, and the tradition built upon them sought to dismantle. So all of a sudden, thinkers were exposed to radically different worldviews from radically different traditions. Some denied that we could be sure of anything, while others denied that the soul is immaterial or non-physical, and some denied that we could know the purpose of things, and so on. So the first historical movement that set the stage for Descartes was the Renaissance. The second movement that immediately followed the Renaissance was the Protestant Reformation. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther were openly hostile to the tradition of Aristotle and the classical and medieval world that built upon that tradition. Luther famously said that theology should have nothing to do with Aristotle at all, and that Aristotle is an enemy of the Christian message. In his view, we need not turn to the darkened philosophers when we can turn to the enlightened religious teachings. Immediately following the Protestant Reformation, we are introduced to the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution made two major shifts. First, it turned the focus of thinkers from studying God and the soul to focusing more upon the natural physical world that we experience. Second, it did so by undermining the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition. For example, Francis Bacon explicitly rejected the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition because it could not produce. It could not make new inventions like Bacon's method could. Bacon cared about results, and he thought the results of the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition were mere babbling and philosophical talk that had nothing to do with the sensible world that we experience. It is with this context that we introduce Descartes. Descartes lived in a time where the classical tradition could no longer be trusted. Skepticism and materialism were on the rise, and that there was religious fighting between the Catholics and Protestants regarding who was the true church, and on top of that, modern science began to substitute for philosophy. Now that we have the historical background in place, we can turn to the question of who exactly Rene Descartes was. As I noted a bit earlier, Descartes was a French philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 17th century. He is often called the father of modern philosophy. This is obviously not because he was the first philosopher, otherwise there would be no Plato or Aristotle. Rather, he represents a major turning point in the history of thought. He concerned himself with epistemology. Descartes had what we would call a classical education. He was educated by the Jesuits, who trained their students in grammar, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. In recounting his studies, Descartes noted something quite interesting. While people quibble and disagree regarding philosophical and even religious matters, nobody actually disagrees on mathematical truths. For example, everyone has an opinion concerning the existence of God and whether God's existence can be known through natural reason alone. But nobody disputes the Pythagorean theorem, that given any right-angled triangle, the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the squares on the other two sides. But why is that? Why don't people disagree on mathematical truths? It's because the ideas in math are clear and distinct. When we study very basic geometry, for example, we pretty much know what a triangle is. We can even reason about what must be true of the angles in a triangle if the triangle were, say, equilateral. We can prove that all the angles in an equilateral triangle must be equal. That's something we can know through reason. We don't see people fighting about whether equilateral triangles really do have equal internal angles. Everyone just agrees. And for those who want to know why, mathematicians offer a proof that no one really disputes. And so Descartes' key move then is this. Given that mathematics gives us knowledge that we are completely sure about, and given that people don't fight about these mathematical truths, what if we built the foundation of philosophy on something that's similar to the foundation of math? Of course, he does not mean that the foundation of philosophy will be built on shapes, for example. Rather, he means that just as the study of mathematics begins with a clear foundation, and all of our knowledge is built on that foundation, we can begin philosophy with a clear and certain foundation, and build all of our other knowledge on that same foundation. Now, prior to sharing some of Descartes' insights, something should be said about the way he writes his famous work, the Meditations on First Philosophy. He writes in the first person, and this is purposeful. In our previous lecture introducing epistemology, we noted how epistemology concerns itself with knowledge, and that knowledge concerns itself with judgments. Since there is an element of judgment that is personal, an element that involves us as individuals, there is an element of philosophy that must be personal. So in retracing Descartes' steps, we are retracing, or perhaps even retracing our own minds. So if our goal is to have knowledge that we can be completely sure about, where do we begin? Well, we can begin by doubting those things that are false, or even those things that are probably true but not true for sure. The goal isn't to find beliefs that are probably true or most likely true, because we could still be wrong about those beliefs. Rather, the goal is to find those beliefs that we cannot be wrong about. And so let's start off with our senses. Can we be absolutely certain of what we know from our senses? Or do our senses deceive us at times? Well, let's think of an example. When we put a straw into a glass of water, what happens? Well, the straw looks bent. But the straw actually isn't bent, so our sight doesn't always give us accurate information. But what about hearing? Are there not occasions where we might think we heard our name called, let's say, but in reality we didn't? Well, yeah, that seems to have happened at times. So it appears that our hearing can deceive us at times. What about the sense of smell? Sometimes we think we smell, say, smoke, only to discover that nothing is burning. Or we think that food has gone bad because of the smell, but it turns out to be perfectly fine. So even our sense of smell can mislead us. Well, what about taste? It seems that taste can deceive us as well. When we are sick, things taste different. Something sweet might taste bitter, for example, or something flavorful might taste bland. So taste is not always reliable either. And what about touch? Well, touch can deceive us too. Think of when you put one hand in cold water and the other in warm water, and then place both hands into lukewarm water. The same water feels warm to one hand and cold to the other. Or think of when your foot, say, falls asleep. You feel tingling or numbness that doesn't match what's actually happening. So even touch is not perfectly reliable. So the first point is simple. Our senses sometimes deceive us. And since our goal is to find something that we cannot be wrong or deceived about, we cannot place the foundation of all our knowledge on our senses. We need something more certain, something that we can be more sure about. But the argument goes further. Even if our senses sometimes deceives us, maybe they are still reliable when things are clear, close, and obvious. For example, if I'm sitting by a fire and I see the flames and feel the warmth, surely I can trust that I'm sitting by a fire, right? But consider this. Have you ever had a dream that felt completely real while you're in it? In dreams, we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell things that seem just as vivid as waking life. Only when we wake up do we realize it was a dream. So each of us has to wonder, how do I know that right now I am not dreaming? If dreams can imitate reality perfectly, then anything that comes from the senses could be doubted. So if we must doubt our senses, what about our memories? Can our memories deceive us? It seems that they can. Sometimes, for example, we remember an event one way, but after trying to recall the details, we notice gaps and we try to fill them in. We might believe those details are accurate, but they may not be. And our memories are also weak. If memory were something we could be completely certain about, we wouldn't forget things so easily. But we do. So memory cannot be the foundation of certain knowledge. Well, what about our reason? Can we make reason that foundation for all our knowing? Well, not quite. If reason gave us a foundation for knowledge that we could be completely sure about, then we wouldn't be able to make mistakes in our reasoning. But we do. Sometimes we rationalize someone's behavior and think our explanation is perfectly reasonable, but it turns out to be wrong. So even our reasoning abilities can mislead us. But our reasoning can mislead us to an even greater extent. Think of it this way. It is at least possible, it is at least conceivable for there to be some all-powerful evil genius to exist. Right? It might not be the case, but it's at least possible. We might say it's very highly unlikely, but again, it's at least possible. And so again, since we are seeking knowledge that we are completely sure about, knowledge that we cannot be wrong about, we at least have to entertain the possibility of such an evil genius existing. Could this evil genius not, say, trick us to believe things that seem absolutely certain, like the truths of mathematics? Maybe 2 + 3 = 5 only seems true because some powerful deceiver is manipulating our thoughts. Of course, this is probably not actually happening, but that's the point. It's probably or most likely not happening. But I cannot be completely certain that it isn't happening, and so I at least have to entertain the possibility. And so, to summarize, we are looking for a foundation to build all our knowledge on. We want this foundation to be sure and sturdy, based on things that we are completely sure about. Because of that, we know we cannot make our senses the foundation, since they can deceive us. This means that even though I think I'm talking to you, I could be deceived. I would not be able to tell whether you are real or not. Neither can we place our memory or reason as the foundation, since our memory and reason can lead us astray. So that raises a question. Does that mean that we cannot know anything? No, not quite. We can know something. Notice how we can be deceived by our senses, our memory, and our reason. But if we can be deceived, there must be a we who are deceived. In other words, even though I cannot be certain about the existence of my senses, memory, or reason, I can be completely certain about the fact that I exist. I can't be certain, at least not yet, that you exist, because to know that I would need to use my senses. But I can at least be certain of the fact that I exist. Either I am deceived about my existence or I am not. If I'm not deceived, then I exist. But if I am deceived, then there must be an I to be deceived. So either way, I must exist. And this is something that I am certain about. But what am I? So I know I exist, but what am I? What does it mean for me to exist? I don't know with complete certitude that I have a body yet. So I'm not in a position to say that I am an animal. But I do know that I'm thinking. I am a thinking thing. But what does it mean to be a thinking thing? Well, I know that I can doubt, understand, judge, will, imagine, and sense. I don't yet know whether I do these things with a body, but I at least know that I have the ability to do them. And so in short, I am a thinking thing, a thing who doubts, who understands, judges, wills, imagines, and senses. This is something I cannot be deceived about, and it becomes the foundation upon which I can build all of my other knowledge. And so if my existence is the foundation that I can be completely certain of, what can I build on this foundation that is just as certain? Well, I know that I came to the conclusion that I exist. But how did I come to know this? I knew it through thinking, through doubting, questioning, and reflecting. And when I look at myself as a thinking thing, I notice something important. I am not perfect. I make mistakes. I lack knowledge, and I am limited. But I also notice that I have an idea of something far greater than myself, an idea of a perfect being. Since in being an imperfect being, that assumes that I have knowledge of what a perfect being is. But where did this idea come from? It cannot come from me because I am not perfect. An imperfect being cannot be the source of the idea of perfection. So there must be something perfect that placed this idea in me. In other words, there must be a God. And since God is a perfect being, he cannot lack anything. He must have complete knowledge, complete power, and complete goodness. Otherwise, he would not be perfect. And if he were not perfect, I would not have the idea of perfection in the first place. But since I do have this idea of perfection, it follows that God must exist. So now I am certain not only of my own existence, but also of the existence of God. But the fact that God exists raises a pretty tricky problem. I have the ability to do certain things, like understand, judge, imagine, and sense. These faculties didn't come from me, since I am imperfect. They were created by God in his power and goodness. So the question is this: if God made me as a thinking thing, a thing that understands, judges, imagines, and senses, why is it that I can be wrong about the things I understand, judge, imagine, and sense? Why can I be deceived, in other words, if God gave me the ability to think? I already know that God is perfect, so he cannot create something that is defective in its very nature. So where does this imperfection come from? Where does my ability to err and make mistakes come from? Now, as a thinking thing, I know that I have the ability to understand, and I also have the ability to will. Through my will, I am able to believe things I clearly understand or believe. I am able to believe things I clearly understand or believe things that I do not clearly understand. If I only believe what I clearly and distinctly understand, then I cannot be in error. But if I choose to believe things that I do not fully understand, then I can fall into error. So the ability to make mistakes does not come from God. It comes from me. It comes from my will extending beyond what my intellect actually grasps. And I'll say that again because that's important. The ability to make mistakes does not come from God. It comes from me. It comes from my will extending beyond what my intellect actually grasps. And so if I wish to avoid error, I should only give my assent. I should only give my assent and only believe what I clearly and distinctly understand. And so far then, I know that I exist and that I am a thinking thing. And upon this foundation, I also know that an all-powerful and all-perfect being, namely God, must exist. And I now know where my error comes from. My error and the ability to make errors arises when I choose to believe things without sufficient understanding. But there is still one more question left, and an important one too. How do I know that the world outside of me exists? And how do I know that I should actually trust my senses? Well, I recognize within myself that I have a strong tendency to believe that the world outside of me exists. For example, even though I am not yet completely certain that the external world exists, the world outside of my internal mind, I'm still not going to, say, touch a fire. I naturally believe that fire is hot and that the physical world is real. Or again, I have a strong tendency to believe that I am not the only human being in the world, which is why I am giving this lecture in the first place. It wouldn't make sense to give a lecture if I think I am the only being in the world. But how do I ground this natural tendency on the completely true and certain foundation that I've built? Well, I know that God exists. We've already established that. And that God is perfect. As a perfect being, God is all-powerful and all good. And since God is all good, he would not deceive me. So if God created me and gave me a natural inclination to believe that the external world exists, then I can trust that this inclination is not misleading. In other words, because God is perfect and created me with this tendency, I can trust that the world outside my mind really does exist. I can also trust that you all exist. I cannot be wrong about this because a perfect God would not allow my natural, God-given instincts to systematically deceive me. Now, of course, this does not mean that my senses can never make mistakes. It simply means that I can trust my senses when they are used properly. I must use my judgment to determine when my senses are giving me accurate information and when they might be misleading. What we have found in all of this, and of course I can now refer to us as we, since I know that we exist, is that we cannot doubt forever. Skepticism is not a viable philosophical position. Skepticism claims that we cannot be certain about anything. Yet by following the method of doubt all the way through, we discover that we are certain of our own existence, the existence of God, and the existence of the external world. The problem of skepticism, then, is that the skeptic is not skeptical enough of their own skepticism. The insight Descartes teaches us is that if we take skepticism seriously, we cannot seriously remain skeptics. Now, of course, there are questions that remain. We have established that we are thinking things. We know we have bodies. But we still have to ask, what exactly is the relationship between the mind and the body? Are we simply minds trapped in bodies? Or are we some kind of union of mind and body? Now, after the time of Descartes, two major philosophical camps emerge: the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists argue that we are fundamentally minds, and that truth is ultimately grounded in reason. The empiricists, on the other hand, argue that we are fundamentally embodied beings, and that truth is ultimately grounded in what we sense. The question for us, of course, is who is right. After all, Descartes has shown us that part of philosophy involves self-knowledge. But if we want to know ourselves, we must understand what kind of beings we are. And so in the next lecture, we will examine the empiricists to see what insights they offer and whether they can shed light on our nature so that we can attain genuine self-knowledge. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.